This video is sponsored by my day job. All views and opinions are my own. Likes and subs are appreciated, but don't hit the notification button. Does anybody actually even do that? Seems annoying. Don't do that. Scars Above launched back in February to little buzz. I only saw a handful of reviews on it, and a couple just reduced it to a Returnal Clone, and a few recommended just wait on a sale even at the AA price. So of course I picked it up at launch.
I thought this was America! Huh? Isn't this America?
And it just sat on the shelf in my never-ending backlog until recently. So is the label it picked up as a basic Returnal Clone accurate, or is there more to this game? Well, let's get into it. Welcome back to JBG. Today we're looking at Scars Above on PS5. One of the things I've noticed since beginning this YouTube journey
I'm going on an adventure!
is that I'm giving a lot more AA games a chance than I used to. Scars Above being one of these. Scars Above is a AA sci-fi third-person shooter with light Souls elements by Madhead Games. When I asked a buddy of mine if he had even heard of it while I was playing through it, he looked it up and said it looked pretty mid. Apparently that's a younger way of saying mediocre.
Howdy do, fellow kids.
Now, even knowing the designation of AA kind of translates to certain aspects being mediocre, I feel like it's a bit reductive. The same as just being labeled a Returnal Clone. Let's go through it though, and I'll get to a price point recommendation on this thing. Spoiler warning, due to the way the story's told at the beginning, I'm going to consider this a spoiler section. I'm not going to spoil the majority of the story, but considering the basic setup takes a bit into the game to really understand, if you think you might want to go into it blind, skip to the next chapter. So Scars Above opens up with you on a ship approaching a giant triangle-looking anomaly floating above Earth called the Metahedron. You play as Kate Ward, a scientist assigned to what's called a SCARS team. This stands for Sentient Contact and Response Team. With only a little bit of plot set up on the ship, you find yourself transported to an alien world. You wake up and have no idea what's going on, so your main purpose is to figure out what the f*** just happened and how to get off the alien planet, while also dealing with the hostile life on the planet. Now this is just a general gloss over to avoid major spoilers, but I did find the story to be one of the aspects of the game that kept me going through it. But there's definitely some interesting ideas in the mechanics here too. So I already mentioned this is a third-person shooter with light Souls elements. You start out with a plasma cutter melee weapon with your basic attacks tied to your stamina bar, but you pick up your initial gun with an electric shot almost immediately. One of the interesting switch-ups they did here is your shooting is elemental based, and different guns have different styles of shot pattern. So your second weapon you're going to pick up is a fire shot weapon that has a charge shot mechanic pretty early. Eventually you'll pick up a grenade scatter shot style ice gun and a shotgun styled acid gun. You really won't be relying on the melee too much later in the game, more just to try and make some space if you get swarmed. You're going to stick primarily to guns throughout your playthrough. The elemental effects is what switches up the combat during different fights here. Certain enemies will have glowing weak points colored to the associated elemental weakness. Basically a blue is going to be electric, red fire, that kind of thing. There's certain environmental effects to the gun elements too, like a blockage that needs to be burned away with your charge shot, or keeping out of the water with the ice gun, letting you walk on top to avoid parasites in the water. There's some puzzle type elemental use to the boss fights too, but I won't spoil any of those since those are fun to figure out. You'll pick up ammo from the environment. The lore idea behind this is you created the weapons based off of these plants in the area, so that's where you're going to source the ammo for them. You also pick up all the basic weapons through the story, but there are alternative fire options you can find pretty easily if you go exploring throughout the side paths. For the most part, this is a linear game. There are side areas to explore and find upgrades, and knowledge XP, but most just loop back to the main paths. So this definitely isn't a huge open world type game. Speaking of your knowledge XP, that's how your skill points work in this game. You aren't getting experience for killing enemies here. You're a scientist, so you gaining knowledge is basically letting you invent your upgrades. You get this XP from scanning enemies on a first encounter, scanning plant life, and in knowledge cubes you'll find scattered throughout the levels. These cubes will be the highest impact for leveling up, so they're the main reason to go off and explore off the main path. Your ability tree has 4 tiers, requiring certain progression of lower levels before starting on the top level abilities for increased ability point costs. Some are basic health and stamina increases, some are more action related like rapid reload ability or extended gadget battery. Your gadgets you invent by finding them in levels and are crafted with fiber you pick up all over the place. It's a basic consumable that covers most of your crafting here. I found some of these gadgets more useful than others, like a slow time field that lets you flank enemies to attack a weak spot a lot easier, or a shield that'll absorb damage for a couple hits. But these will all come down to your personal playstyle more than anything. If you're actively looking around, you won't have much trouble finding all the weapon upgrades and enough experience to level up all your abilities by late game. And I mentioned Scars Above also has some light Souls elements to it too. You have pillars where you save and it respawns enemies, and this is also where you'll respawn if you die. That's about it for the Souls elements though. That's why I say light Souls elements. Any shortcut or puzzle solved will stay completed even if you die and respawn at a pillar, so it's much more forgiving than the typical Souls clone. So how's the combat? A few reviewers found the combat kind of lackluster, and I don't exactly agree. The enemy variety isn't bad, but this is also a pretty short game, so mixing it up every level isn't too tough. Movement can be a bit slow, and a little bit janky at times, but I only noticed a few hitbox problems outside of a couple larger enemies. Like I said though, it's much more forgiving than the average Souls game, so I didn't even get close to rage quitting on the normal difficulty. Playing through 3/4 of the game on easy for a speed run, I didn't even die once. So it does feel a bit more lackluster on easier difficulty, I guess. But I'll go back to why I played it again for the speed run when I talk about the trophy glitch I had. Overall, I did have a lot of fun with the bosses, and that tends to be the highlights of this genre anyway. The first one is a pretty straightforward fight like most introductory bosses, but there are a few elemental puzzle bosses later in the game. They're a lot of fun to put together how to take them out. Most of them are pretty easy to figure out, but there was one boss I was stuck on for a while before I figured out the mechanic. Now, like every game, there's some goods and some bads here. Depending on the person is going to be how much you find these to be good or bad. I honestly like the change up to experience and leveling system, and the idea they gave an in-game reason as to why all of a sudden you have a new ability because you invented it based off of knowledge gained, over just killing things and all of a sudden you have a protection shield because you have enough experience. This may throw some people off since it could deter a player from engaging enemies if you aren't getting any experience for it, but I thought the combat was fun enough for the playtime of the game, so I still killed almost everything on the first run. I made some really impressive set pieces here for a AA game, but the character model specifically screamed AA. Now, if you aren't overly sensitive to some graphics looking a little bit dated, then this isn't going to be much of a deal breaker. Though I do think this is just a lower resolution Sarah Ryder from Andromeda. There are some clipping glitches that I noticed in quite a few areas, usually involved with terrain traversal. At times it doesn't even look like you're touching the environment when you're pulling yourself up over a ledge, and a few occasions where the vaulting mechanic just wasn't registering. These are relatively minimal. For me, it wasn't immersion breaking enough to not still enjoy the game. The story is what kept me involved the entire time. It's a little bit predictable late game, but I honestly didn't see the ending coming the way it did. It's not winning any awards, but it keeps you going through the smaller playtime here. That's what I think will be the largest hangout for most people, and the fact there isn't much replay value here. There are very minimal Metroidvania aspects towards the end, but I'm talking very minimal. So most of the areas you're going through, you're only going to go through them once, and then move on with the story. There's no New Game Plus, and you actually lose your save file when you hit the credits. It was a little off-putting knowing I needed to replay some sections and getting back to the title screen after credits only to see a new game option. And then of course there's the playtime. With you essentially getting the entire story and all the upgrades if you're thorough on your first run, you're only looking at about 8 to 10 hours depending on how much trouble you have with the bosses. I tend to take a little bit longer than most people on games, and my first playthrough was about 9 hours getting almost everything. So considering there isn't a New Game Plus and the shorter length, with little likelihood you're going to miss anything, this might just end up being a single run. I did decide to speedrun to get the final glitch trophy, so let's talk about the trophies real quick. Now, I'm not exactly a trophy hunter, but I'll go for a platinum on a game if it doesn't demand too much grinding, and if I enjoyed the game enough to spend a little extra time on it. You don't really need any kind of a guide here for all the trophies or achievements, but I did have to spend some time trying to get the last one. There's a glitch that can happen with a few trophies tied to scanning things if you die right around one of the progression marks. There didn't seem to be any way to find out exactly where it glitched for me. It just didn't pop for me by the time I hit endgame. But I knew I was missing only the trophy for scanning all the environmental resources. The thing is, I really did enjoy the first playthrough, and considering the shorter length of the game, I didn't mind going back later for a speedrun. On the easiest difficulty after already understanding the mechanics, this only took me about 3 hours to get to the 3/4 mark that I needed. For me, that's not a big deal at all. Some of the early game enemies that were pretty tough for me on the first time to figure out were a lot more fun going through on easy and just obliterating them. So if you're a trophy hunter, this is a very direct and enjoyable game to add another platinum to your profile. And it's not going to take you 40 hours to get that platinum. So at what price point would I really recommend this game to someone who is curious about it? Well, that's where I'm going to kind of feel bad for the devs here. I really did like this game, and had a lot of fun playing through it, even having to speedrun it for a glitch trophy. But at launch, this was $50, and I think that's way too high here. There's a little replay value, maybe another playthrough a year or two down the road if you enjoyed it, but even then, I feel like it would take a lot less than the 8 to 10 hours since you probably are going to remember all the puzzle elements to the bosses. I thought they put a really interesting setting together here, and the story was told well enough that it kept me engaged. But there isn't much else for me here after that. They made some impressive environments on a AA budget, but the character models and some of the creature models, they can kind of be a bit jarring. The combat was satisfying for me, but that might just be because of the shorter game length. It means that it couldn't even outstay its welcome. I'm still finding this game priced in the $30 range, and I wouldn't even recommend it at $30. To be honest, I would completely recommend this around the $15 range, maybe $20 if you were really curious about it. So this would still have to drop a bit for what it's still going for. I just can't recommend any higher than that with how little there is to do after you roll credits. Let me know down in the comments if you played Scars Above and what you thought of it, or if you were considering it and think you're still going to pick it up. Until next time.
I'm sorry, I thought this was America.
What? Toodaloo, motherfucker. Hey.